to the September NASPA Knowledge Community Student Leadership Programs webinar, hosted by, again, the NASPA Knowledge Community Student Leadership Program. And we are so thankful and happy today to have Mark Torres with us today, who's going to be presenting and talking to us about the intersectionality of leadership, or leadership across education, across campuses, and across individual campuses as well. And so we are so happy to have him here, and we're going to be going ahead and get started. And so basically, to begin, we want to talk a little bit about the program and the presentation.
It sounds like Ross might have lost us on his sound, so I'll go ahead and join in. So we've got Mark Torres from presenting to us today. Talk a little bit about the SLPKC and the webinar series. If you're still trying to figure out how to connect to the conference, you can see the instructions at the bottom of this first slide here. And certainly after, once we kick it off to Mark, we'll kind of move along and have time for questions. Over on the right side of your screen, you should be able to see a chat feature to be able to ask questions when those have come up and what have you. So just want to point those things out as you can see them. As well, we'll have a recording available. Post that as soon as it's available. Again, just want to share a little bit about the SLPKC mission, and certainly feel that the webinar series is a way to cultivate a forum for the presentation of new ideas and to share best practices. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and shift it over to Mark. I will give him the right to move through his slides as he feels necessary. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Mark.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone, or I should say good morning for my friends on the West Coast. I just want to acknowledge that technology is a core competency area of student affairs, and I think we are all working on that. And so I apologize for leaving the call momentarily. As he said, my name is Mark Torres. I serve as the Assistant Director for Community Engagement at Emory University, and I also have the privilege to work with ACPA's Commission for Student Involvement as their Leadership Education Chair. Before we get into the thick of things this morning or afternoon, I want to let you all know that by nature, my research interests really rest in identity development and intersectionality. And I believe there's a direct and powerful connection between individual identity and leadership capacity and efficacy. We're going to explore that a little bit in detail later. But, when I first joined the ACPA Commission for Student Involvement as the Leadership Education Chair, I began noticing strong connections between my work on the intersections of identity and how we conceptualize leadership. And so today my hope is that we can engage in some innovative thinking together. So really quickly, before we start creating these lofty goals, when I say innovative thinking, there's really nothing brain science-y here that we're going to get into. It's more so talking about a new perspective, really beginning to view our work a little bit differently. And my hope is that we're going to walk away with a slightly different lens through which we can view our work as leadership educators, specifically focusing on intersectional and multidisciplinary work. To kick us off, I'm going to show a brief 2-minute clip of one of my favorite TED Talks by Chimamanda Adichie. I was actually first introduced to this TED Talk by Dr. Stephen Quay at the 2010 National Leadership Symposium, and it's really revolutionized the way I've begun to think about identity as well as leadership education. So I'm just going to attempt to load this video now. All right, everyone, we should be back to our main slides, although it reverted back to the beginning. I just wanted to show you the beginning snippet of this TED Talk, the single story, and by all means, please watch the entire thing because it's incredibly powerful, but I don't want to keep you all here for 2 hours. So what she presents here is an example of just how powerful perception is, or how powerful it can be. How we perceive something as reality or truth is how we will proceed. We begin to internalize these stories. And so now I want to take some time to apply this theme of the videos to leadership as we know it. And I'd like to invite you all as participants to use the chat function over on the right side of your screen to provide a brief commentary on what we might consider as the single story of leadership education. What are the common stereotypes of leadership? And I'm not talking about just the common textbook definitions of leadership, which we will get to later, but what are the student perceptions? How is leadership perceived on your campuses? And so at this time, I'm going to invite you all to post some brief thoughts using the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen.
I'm going to jump in here. I might ask, as people are chatting, when you're under send to choose all participants, and that will allow everyone to see all of our responses.
Right, so we have a lot of comments about positional leadership. Leadership is scary. It equates to bad and strong people. I think we have a lot of that notion in our current elections right now. Responsibility. And I do believe also, someone made a great point, that it's beyond them. It's sort of the untouchable. Also that it can't be learned, great point. All right, so at this point, now we've had to talk about what are the common perceptions. I want us to review what we espouse leadership currently. When we think about leadership as a discipline, what is it that we espouse? And our definition of understanding leadership can largely be understood through the lens of the social change model of leadership development, developed by the Higher Education Research Institute. And what they began to write is that leadership is purposeful, that yes, it is collaborative in nature and it's values-based, that it results in positive change. And so when you go through the social change model, I know that many of us use this on our campuses, the model stresses that leadership is not in fact a position, but it's an intentional, lifelong process of continual learning, both about self and society. It's collaborative in nature, emphasizing the power of shared ground and connection. And leadership has universal potential. It's not beyond you, but all students are potential leaders. And I think most salient to the social change model is that leadership is concerned with affecting change on the behalf of others in society. So this past summer, I had the opportunity to once again attend the National Leadership Symposium in Richmond, and we really took some time to explore the critical questions of leadership education. On the tangible level, we discussed the importance of discerning leader versus leadership development. Whereas leader development is interpersonal and focuses on the person, the individual, leadership development is interpersonal and focusing on the interactions and collaboration among many people. Both are critical, although many of our programs focus on one or the other. And then we also discussed utilizing a lifespan perspective in leadership. Whereas we espouse that leadership is a lifelong process, how often do we operationalize this? How do we begin to recognize that students are not blank slates when they step foot on our campuses as first years, nor will their leadership journeys really cease when they depart our campuses as graduates? So how do we really begin to better situate the context of college student leadership education as being somewhat in the early to middle part of a lifelong process? And finally, We discussed the power of culture and identity in leadership. As our nations continue to become more globally connected, how do we embrace and really integrate the power of cultural learning in our programs? And so then on the conceptual level, we organize these conversations into three key components of effective leadership education. Rigorous design that is creative, complex, and tailored to empower individuals to learn. Experiences that are transformative in nature and accessible to all. And intentionality and learning-focused programs. The critical importance of capturing demonstrated results. And here it is, folks. The essence of leadership education through these conversations in the 21st century is interdisciplinary learning. It's being able to walk away with a solid understanding of 5 key questions. And that first question is, who am I? Who am I as an individual in my many pieces? Who am I in the context of others? What do I believe and what are my values? And most importantly, why? Why are those my values? Why do I believe those things? What role or impact will I have in society? And how can I best achieve this vision? So when we think about this interdisciplinary lifelong learning process, it's us beginning to facilitate growth among these 5 key questions. Who am I? Who am I in the context of others? What do I believe? Why? My impact and how I'm going to have that impact. How do I achieve that vision? And so I want to take you a moment and using your checkbox function on the side, do you think that these 5 questions sum up what it is that we are trying to instill and develop within our students through leadership education? Feel free now to agree or disagree. I'll give us about 30 more seconds because if you're anything like me, you're probably still searching for the checkbox. Where is this? So for the most part, it seems like we're in agreement that this is a good way to sum it up. I think that Colby brings up a great point that there is this piece of congruence of how do you go from step A to step D? How do you say, okay, well, we have these things of who I am in the context of others, what do I believe? How do I ensure that those are what I authentically show up as and that I am really enacting my values? And I think that it's through the process of being able to fully answer these questions that we begin to that students begin to experience some dissonance sometimes around their ability to enact congruence. And I think that perhaps is something that might need to be added to this list of, am I living my values? Great point. And so moving on, I think that, right now you all are probably sitting there, okay, innovation, that's wonderful, that's very good, but why? Why are these things important? And here it is. This is why. This is classic Lewin, adopted by Bronfenbrenner, that states that development, and in this case, thinking about those key questions, is a function of person and environment interactions. This, at the heart of all of our work as leadership educators, is why we do what we do. Whether you're in student organizations, fraternity, sorority life, whether you're working in an Office of Multicultural Programs and Services, or in something deemed a quote-unquote leadership office, what we do is facilitate development. And we're going to focus on the interaction between the person, the environment, and what that development begins to look like today. Because there's only so much we can control for in the actual person. And we actually leave a lot of that to our admissions offices. And again, the experiences that those who set foot on our campuses had prior to coming to our campus. So how do we begin to translate theory to practice, to operationalize our understanding of holistic development, and specifically holistic leadership development? As I said before, my core research interests rest in identity development, specifically focusing on multiple marginalized identities. This model is a lot, and we're going to break it down for a hot second. But it really captures the understanding of person-environment interaction. On the left side, you see social identities. And this is critical in recognizing that who I am has a direct impact on how I show up in this world, in a group, in my classroom. It is inextricably linked to my leadership. This is actually the reconceptualized model of multiple identities by Abe Jones and McEwen, which describes our social identities, one of which might be leader, as multiple, intersecting, and influenced by environment or context. And those little red dots that you see, those are key salience plots. And they speak to how strongly we identify with any one of our identities at a given time. On the opposite side of sort of that little wall there, you see context and environment. In this case, it's represented by Bronfenbrenner's nested system environment. And so in the middle, you see these little circles that sort of look like grapes. And those are microsystems, and they're the immediate spaces in which our students live. They're residence halls, they're classrooms, their student organizations, or their jobs. These are the environments that they sit in which they touch and feel. Then you'll notice that there's a circle outside of that little cluster of circles, and that's called the mesosystem. The mesosystem is really the aggregate of students' immediate environments and the interactions between them. For example, if a conversation takes place in class about religion, and it makes them reflect on perhaps the church they go to, that right there is interplay between multiple immediate environments, and that's the energy that comes from a mesosystem. From there, you have the exosystem, which is the context for the mesosystem. So our environments that our students don't immediately live in, but have very real impact. And the example I always give is, right now during the recession, while a student may not show up in their parents' workplace, they are not physically there, the cuts and the pressure and the stress added at work has a very real impact on their parents, who are a part of one of their very real immediate family unit environments. And so it's beyond the touch of their immediate environment, but it's impacting their lives. And the last circle, the last ring, is the macro system, and that's influenced greatly by culture and society in which a person lives. The belief systems and ideology of a culture influence people directly, but the individual doesn't always have much freedom in determining his or her surroundings. Some influences, or examples of these influences, include politics or religion and different norms of cultures. And so if you were to zoom back a little bit and look at this, what I learned through initial research is that the two have multi-directional, mutually effective influence. That the person impacts the environment impacts the person. And the interplay between the person and the environment is what outputs that development of identity, of meaning making, and specifically talking about our conversation today of leadership capacity. Again, we're talking about intersections here, and diversity and the fusion of ideas. Yes, yes, but how? And are we ever going to hit the ground? I know that many of you who are not really interested in theory per se are wondering these things of what does this mean on the ground? What does this mean for the work I do in my everyday? And what it means is that we must begin to deconstruct leadership. That single story that we talked about. Here's how we move forward. And we often get stuck in what we call functional areas. And I use that term distastefully because I think it disables us from being able to truly see the interconnections of our work in our offices. And in learning to deconstruct leadership, we break it into three pieces. There are our environments, and I just noticed that I spelled environments wrong, so the gift of imperfection, folks. Pedagogies and discipline learning. What we begin to classify as leadership is not always necessarily, it doesn't span all three of those. And I think that what we see as leadership often, we say, oh, it's all the same. But how do we begin to really break it down into pieces? As I said, that I work with the ACPA Commission for Student Involvement, and because I'm a part of that in-group, I'm going to pick on us for a second. Right now, we have 4 functional areas in the Commission for Student Involvement. We say that there's leadership, there's service and service learning, there's fraternity and sorority life, there's student organizations. And so we have these 4 quote-unquote functional areas, but here's the deal. Leadership is not a functional area, it's a discipline. Service learning is not a functional area or a discipline, it's a learning pedagogy. Fraternities and sororities are student organizations, and student organizations are specific types of campus environments. Are we beginning to see the disconnect here? We have to really deconstruct the single story of that our work is disparate, disconnected, or different. The truth is that leadership is the interplay of all of these things, and that it doesn't occur without all of them being in place. And this is what this is beginning to look like at Emory University. We're working to restructure our programs to focus on the interdisciplinary collaboration and learning. And as I said, that's what we believe here is the essence of 21st century leadership. This is the model I've created to restructure Volunteer Emory. And so Volunteer Emory is about 32 years old, and it's the university's signature service program. So when people think about things at Emory, Volunteer Emory is really up there with its more notable programs. On the bottom left, we have Cold's model of experiential learning. And so what you'll notice is that service learning is the core pedagogy that we use. And through ongoing engagement, students are working toward positive change. We're beginning to ask sort of, for what and for whom do you serve? What is their vision? And so to show you how this connects, I'm going to use this handy dandy little marker, is that they go around this circle, and this circle continues to lead them as they progress deeper and deeper in their commitment to the social justice issues that they're working toward, sort of like a corkscrew. What you also see is in the middle is intercultural competence and leadership capacity, which I'm going to break down in just a moment. But those are our core learning outcome categories that we say that through this process, through this pedagogy of service learning, in working towards achieving justice, sort of that why do we do what we do, students are learning leadership capacity and they're learning intercultural competence. And so looking specifically at this, Cold's learning model, at the top, you start with a concrete experience, you move into reflective observation and sort of learn a little bit more about that. Then you say, well, what does this mean? I recognize that XYZ made me feel a certain way. How do I situate that knowledge now? And moving into active experimentation, how do I then begin to integrate that into my everyday, into moving forward? And I always like to use a great example of how I believe that Twitter is sort of cold in practice, where a student goes and we use service in our mandated community service program through our Office of Student Conduct, and say a student tweets, wow, I have to go do service, this is gonna suck. And then they go and they engage in hands-on service. And then through our intentional student conduct process, they actually meet with us again and say, well, how did that, what are your values and what sort of impact did you have that got you into the student conduct process? Now, what sort of impact did you have on your community service trip when you were tutoring children at a local refugee school? And they say, oh, well, that was pretty impactful. And they go through that ongoing reflection with us, and then they get to abstract conceptualization, where they're able to say, wow, I really had a great time experiencing, this hands-on service opportunity through Volunteer Emory, even though it was a part of it. Perhaps, we hope their development is that they want to have a positive impact more often, or that they want to do service more often. But, that's just one example. Completing Cold's learning cycle, what we then do is we then engage Emory students in social justice dialogues, and really helping them say, okay, so you went to this shelter. Why does that shelter exist? What are the greater issues of power and privilege behind them? And again, engaging folks in that abstract piece and helping them take that knowledge as well as those experiences and integrate them again into hands-on service. And just a quick caveat is I know that not all of us are service learning practitioners per se in the traditional sense, but service can be can be students who are engaged in programming boards. And I know that that is not always the first thing that you think of, but service doesn't have to be serving soup in a soup kitchen. I tend to believe that those are a little bit more transformative experiences. But in developing a homecoming concert, students are still providing service. They're still having that experiential learning, just to a different audience. And so really beginning to see how do we use service learning and Kolb's experiential learning model as the core. And so going back, as I said, looking directly at the learning outcomes, you'll notice that there's a dotted line between the two. And that's because we believe that leadership capacity and intercultural competence are connected. In developing one, you develop the other as well. And so I'm going to go ahead now and show you some specific outcomes. When we think about leadership capacity, we break it down actually using Bloom's taxonomy. And so this is a list of leadership outcomes that we've developed for our surface level participants. So WST stands for our weekly service trip program, or a large scale single day service event where students come and do 1 day of service and they leave. And we believe that they just skim the surface. And in doing that, they're going to identify some personal skills and abilities. They're probably going to be able to describe some personal identities and background experiences on their own, and engaging in those different from them. They might be able to name some personal values through that service experience, describe connections between classroom learning and practical out of classroom experience, collaborate with a diverse group of others, and enhance self-efficacy for affecting positive social change. And so obviously that piece of education and reflection is critical to achieving these outcomes. And that's where we can really say, okay, here's what we want to be about. Now, how do we strive to just really be about it? And then on the intercultural competence side of things at the surface level, because talking about culture tends to be a little bit more sensitive to students, and some of these overlap, but it's those pieces of identifying privilege, personal identities and background experiences, and working across different towards common goals. And you'll notice actually back here, if I scroll back really quickly, you'll notice that there are tenets associated with each of these little outcomes. And this is tied to a program at Emory that I'll highlight very briefly right now. We launched a program at Emory called Leadership Emory, which I'm not going to go into much at this point because I know next month Matt Garrett, our director, is going to present that framework in greater detail. But there are two key takeaways that we've developed. First of all, Leadership Emory is a common leadership language in which we say that those five or six questions that we've talked about, those can be summed up into 5 breakable tenets. And then what we've done is we have engaged staff and faculty and students across campus to help them realize that no one office owns leadership. Even though our office is the Office of Student Leadership and Service, there is leadership taking place in campus dining, in recreation sports, in the classroom, in the Office of Religious Life. It's happening everywhere. And I just think that it's interesting that we as a field say that, we tell our students that leadership is not positional, it's a process. My question is, how do we begin to really internalize that no one owns leadership, and that there's great power in developing a common leadership language that students, faculty, and staff can really unite over. So going back to what we talked about earlier, the essence of leadership education in the 21st century is really this concept of interdisciplinary lifelong learning. And this is textbook in many of our leadership definitions that we espouse. But where we don't connect the dots is that we must become interdisciplinary and collaborative practitioners. That leadership is not owned by the Office of Student Leadership and Service, and social justice comes out of our Center for Social Justice and all these things, but they're all interconnected. And it's the interplay between these different campus environments and offices, and again, the environments and the pedagogies and things that is what generates the process of leadership education. And we have to ask ourselves, are we practicing what we're preaching? as a field, have we created hiring processes that align with this understanding that we espouse? Are we working across departmental lines to engage students at the intersections? Because that's where their lives are, that's where their involvements are, and so often we are not capturing the student at their lived experience. And if we don't do that, we're never going to fulfill our responsibilities as leadership educators and helping them to answer these key questions, which most of us have agreed are sort of like the core of what students, at this point in their life should be able to walk away with some level of development in. And I think that if we don't, we are going to continue to develop students, but only partially. We're going to put our students into our disconnected programs and not really, we're not going to enable them to fully answer the critical questions that will actualize them as the individuals that we hope they become, as the scholars we hope they become, or as the leaders of the 21st century that many of our institutions are espousing that we're creating. We have to learn to transcend the single story of leadership education. And that's where I think that we need to move forward as really as a discipline of seeing the intersection, so that this concept of holistic engagement that we espouse in all of our documents and our understandings and our definitions of leadership is where we are operating. And so at this time, I wanted to leave ample time open for questions. And so that's all the actual content that I have. And so if folks have questions, I encourage you at this point to either raise your hand or put them over in the chat box, and hopefully we can discuss them. Great question. So we're going to start with one that just caught my eye of what would be a great place to start if you're just creating a new leadership program on your small campus. And I think that the biggest part is really taking some time to create an understanding and pulling people together. We also talk about, another question was sort of, how do you work across campus? Really, I think it's about putting together different pieces of campus and allowing sort of abductive logic to take place, allowing these seemingly disparate offices to come together and engage in some collaborative problem solving. And so if you're looking to create a new leadership language, it's important to have people from all over, from the business school, from religious life, from student programs at the table and say, what do we want to be about? Because the reality is that we can't be about everything, because when we become about everything, we become mediocre. And we have a hard time really diving deep into that notion or definition of leadership. And so I think it's important to, if you're starting up, to really take time to conceptualize and be intentional, because as we go back, that if our focus is on learning and on development, we need to know what that trajectory is. We need to know how we're going to specifically structure our programs and how we're going to write that curriculum to get them where we're moving. I think the other question was, one moment. Yes, I think so. I think Jess, I'm not going to say your last name because I don't want to butcher it. She said, can you give some examples of how you've worked with partners across campus? Essentially, how are you modeling leadership as a collaborative process that no one owns? I think that one of the pieces when we started developing this is we had a lot of focus groups, and we really said, like, what does all the literature say? What are our students, our faculty, and staff saying? And there's a great process called appreciative inquiry that is wonderful in structuring those conversations to get people to say, what has been your most transformative leadership experience? They begin to detail those, and all of a sudden you sort of theme it out. And it's, in many ways, it's like conducting a qualitative research project. But on the ground level, we developed a really great partnership with Barclay Forum, which is our student student debate group, and it's a pretty notable group here at Emory. And we partner with them, and we do something called the Atlanta Urban Debate League, where students, like our volunteers, learn how to coach middle and high school students in debate and in public speaking, and they go out and they engage at-risk youth in debate leagues. And that's been a really cool partnership to focus on, to help the Barclay Forum realize that what they're doing is a form of leadership, even though we typically think of it as debate as more political or academic, and help our students who are interested in doing service recognize that they themselves can learn something, and that learning in and of itself is a type of service. We also, and again, I said my supervisor will be speaking about leadership Emory, but it's been really fascinating to develop a quantitative assessment instrument here on campus to capture growth along all of these tenets. So we piloted that, and we had a recent sort of assessment midday conference, and it was incredible to see our campus dining talk about how students who work in campus dining are learning and growing along the social change model of leadership development values. And so I think that so many times one of the reasons that we don't partner is because we build up these assumptions. That it's sort of that scary thing of, oh, faculty don't want to work with us. And I think that sometimes you're right. Sometimes faculty don't want to work with us, and sometimes we don't want to work with faculty, which we have to own up to. But I think that more often than not, it's because we make assumptions based off of this single story that, that leadership is something that comes out of campus life, comes out of an office, service learning is separate. And so that's just been a specific moment of learning for me working at Emory and the University of Georgia. No problem, Jess. I'm scrolling through questions. You'll have many great ones. Someone say, how do we show the value of a shared language and experience? I will recognize that I have great privilege in working at an institution that really values academics and scholarship. And so really, I think a lot of the power for us in being able to reach that tipping point came from the fact that we're at a lot of conferences and we go to a lot of professional development experiences in which this is the conversation. And we've read the research and have put together some pretty persuasive documents that show that, sustained engagement is what really transforms students. It's not your emerging leaders experience in and of itself. It is not being an RA in and of itself. It is understanding and drawing connections between leadership across functional area, as we continue to call it, across their living environments, across their 4 years, drawing on experiences from before they were on campus and long after they leave our campuses. And so that is one privilege that I have to own, is that our staff has been incredibly open, and our administrators have been really empowering and saying, okay, well, show us the literature, show us the assessment. And that's why, going back to that demonstrated result, it is so important to capture what students are learning and why they're learning what they're learning. And so really creating some good quantitative and qualitative data to put your work out there and say, this is the power of it. And looking to other campuses is a great way. George Mason does extraordinary work. Obviously, the University of Maryland, there are campuses across the country doing wonderful work that we can look to as sort of bright spots and say, hey, look at the transformation they've experienced, and how do we tie that benchmarking into our assessment and come up with a pretty persuasive argument. And I do want to bring up this note. I think Sheena said that, we don't want common learning outcomes because they feel like every group of leaders is so different. And I think that every group of leaders is very different, but, it's sort of like every student who walks into a classroom is very different and are going to sort of grow along different trajectories. But the outcomes on that syllabus are still the same. And so what we've begun to do at Emory is we've really begun to create a syllabus for leadership education for Emory University, because we believe that, yes, that some students are just never going to get to 10 at 5. They're never going to say, wow, this is how I see myself in society. They may be stuck, especially, for a lot of students going back to identity who focus or who have so many pieces of identity that they continue to wrestle with, especially during year 1 and 2 on our college campuses. It may take them a little bit longer to be able to reconcile identity and values, and everyone has a different life story, that they may not get there. But what we do is we try to take those common outcomes and work with them intentionally. And so, for example, with Volunteer Emory, I work with all of our students, and my co-directors I have weekly one-on-ones in. And part of the way in which we go about, really being intentional is having them say, based off of your job responsibilities, based off of the leadership skills that we believe you need to possess, when you're hired right now, what do you think that you're strongest in? And what do you think you need more intentional growth along? And then they themselves say, I'm going to be honest, I think that I could give and receive better feedback, that I'm not so great at that. I think that I could do a little bit of a better job in working with others across all these areas. And then we can sort of tailor along the lines that you're saying, Sheena, of how do we then sort of assess the leaders that we're working with and work with them individually. But I think ultimately for us, it's about getting them sort of moving in the same direction. We're trying to get every student moving toward that same North Star, so that at the end of the day, at Emory, we can say, yes, we create brilliant scholars, but we also create individuals who are able to translate that brilliance from their minds into everyday interactions and into positive action within their communities. I'm looking at other questions. One moment. I think the question about community colleges is really interesting, because at Emory we have a 2-year college called Oxford College that isn't necessarily a community college model, but I think they have experienced some similar issues of how do you really engage students when their first year they're a first-year student, their second year they're a senior and graduating from your campus. And I think that that's really important. And I think that one of my colleagues in the field always said that, he works at a community college, so he doesn't always have time to have developmental conversations. But what he does have time to do is to attempt to make student services developmental in nature. And I always just thought that that was really fascinating about how he really tries to make the process a little bit more developmental. But as far as the community college piece goes, and this comes from my own background, I think that it's really important to make very real connections. And that's what I strive to do with my students, is that leadership is not something that we're teaching you just because we believe it's important, but really connecting it to the job, to the careers, to graduate schools, the things that they're going to look at as they leave on that 4th year. And at community colleges, I think that it should be even more salient, because you have 2 years, and as you're saying, on average, you have 2 years to not only acquire education, but also to figure out exactly how that translates to the real world. And so a lot of times we ask our students, what does this mean? How does this make sense? Is this, I ask my students all the time, I was like, is this all crap? Or do you believe that this has real implication for your life? And I think that being able to level with students and ask them those critical questions and allow them to draw the connected dots is really powerful for them, and I think they really appreciate the opportunity rather than me saying, well, there are 5 tenets of leadership, and this is so critical to you, but allow them to find the meaning and say this is. And if they don't believe that it's critical, continue to ask them, and maybe by the time they leave, they'll think it's somewhat important, and maybe by the time they leave, they won't. And so I guess I can't be more helpful than that, but I just think that being able to connect it directly to vocation is so important, because if you look at a Fortune 500 company, if you look at any graduate school, none of them are going to be without working across different collaboration, timeliness, across the board. They want folks who are leaders and who have intercultural competence. I think we have time for one more question, and so I'm scrolling through. I really like this idea of like, what are some of the first steps in helping folks to recognize that they have responsibilities, in this leadership piece. I think that when you begin to level with folks, it's really helpful. We had some really powerful conversations with our Office of Multicultural Programs and Services, because the reality is that sometimes, just as we say, well, leadership is happening everywhere, why aren't you doing more for leadership? We also sort of embody those own things and say, oh, a student struggling with, the coming out process, or is a biracial student who doesn't know where she fits on campus, and we send them down to the Office of Multicultural Programs and Services, and we say, oh, that's not my job. That's a pretty deep one that I'm not going to get into. But the reality is that they're interconnected. And so when we begin to recognize that we all have shared work across not just leadership, but across identity, across ethics and values. And so what we did is we trained over 200 staff members using the same pedagogy that we use for our students. We took them through the presentation, and we said, does this make sense? Are we on the right course? Like, do you believe this is leadership? And then we gave them an intentional time to draw lines and say, in rec sports, how are students learning leadership? And I think that's a pretty easy one when you talk about the essence of a team. But we did that, and it was a very long and arduous process. Let me be the first to say that change takes time, but it was incredibly helpful to see those things. And I think that the more conversation you have, obviously, I know that our Outlook calendars are all quite busy, but if you can find folks to be in that core committee, and I'll say that the committees that we're creating are curriculum committees around these tenets and around this idea of interdisciplinary collaboration. They are interdisciplinary in themselves. So we're having individuals say, how do we write some intentional identity development curriculum that can translate across our programs? Who do we want in that meeting? Well, the first piece is, well, you probably come from our OMPS office, but beyond that, we also need to look at, well, why don't we put someone in there from our Rollins School of Public Health? Why don't we put someone in there from the undergraduate college? Why don't we put someone in there from dining, and allow them to think critically and draw the connections themselves? And then it's less of a imported solution, and it's for them, they've created themselves, and so they are already bought into it. And so I think that a big piece of it is us investing in our staff and allowing them to become experts as well, because once you realize that our work is interdisciplinary, we have to invest in those who are going to be doing that interdisciplinary work, so that at the end of the day, they're still not coming to the leadership office and being like, I can't remember what Tenet 3 is, or wait, how does service learning work again? How should I be structuring these programs? It's about sharing resources as widely as possible. And I know that even within ACPA, we're really having some critical conversations about how do we begin to operationalize the commission around this understanding that leadership is interdisciplinary and needs to be more collaborative, and that there are not 4 functional areas, but it is an interplay of environments, of pedagogies, and of discipline and learning. And so I apologize, we don't have a whole bunch of time left. I just wanted to say thank you all. And if you do have other questions or are interested, in having offline conversation, or if you would like resources, please feel free to email me. And I believe that Ross and Matt will share my contact information. And again, you'll learn much more about Leadership Emory next month by Matt Garrett, the Director of the Office of Student Leadership and Service.
Exactly. I'm just going to echo everything Mark said in just a moment. But first, I want to just thank him so much for being here. He gave us a lot of wonderful information, and you all can echo that as well. And just a whole lot to think about. Mark obviously has had experience in this area and definitely knows what he's talking about. And so thank you so much, Mark, for giving us your time and sharing all this information with us and this insight. And so as Mark said, if you want to take
Uh, Ross has been having technical difficulties, so I'll jump in again. But if you want to kind of message Mark specifically, please do that, and we'll share this out as well with the presentation with the KC through the newsletter and the website. If you're interested in participating, or whether you have suggestions for topics for a future webinar, or if you know someone who would be good, please send those along to the SLPKC, and you can send those directly to Ross. And I've put Ross's contact information there. So please do that, and we'll see what we can do as far as presenting a schedule that'll work for everyone. And again, thanks to Mark for presenting, and